Hello there. As two young Israelis were murdered on the streets of Washington, D.C., the UK bowed to pro-Hamas pressure and chose to freeze trade talks with Israel. Yaron Lashinsky and Sarah Milgrim were walking out of a diplomatic reception near the Jewish Museum in Washington, D.C. They were planning their engagement. They had a future. And then a man approached them with a gun. Moments later, both were lying on the ground. The alleged shooter, Elias Rodriguez, 30 years old, is reported to have shouted, "Free, free Palestine," while being detained. According to police, he had no prior criminal record. There were no warning signs. He just appeared, armed and purposeful, and left two young lives destroyed. Yaron was 28. He worked in the Israeli embassy's political department. Military service behind him. He had 2 degrees, one in diplomacy and one in international relations. And a ring in his pocket. He had planned to propose to Sarah next week in Jerusalem. Sarah Milgrim, a Jewish American embassy staff member, was walking beside him. She was part of the same diplomatic team, the same mission. Their embassy later said, "They were in the prime of their lives. We are heartbroken and devastated." What happened to them is not some or other random violence. This was targeted. This was ideological. And it happened on American soil, just outside the Capitol Jewish Museum. Israel's response was swift and furious. Foreign Minister Gideon Saar said, "This is what happens when world leaders surrender to Palestinian terrorist propaganda of terror and lies." And he directly called out Keir Starmer, Emmanuel Macron and Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney as blameworthy. Saar said their appeasement and silence had consequences, and those consequences were now being paid in Jewish blood. Diaspora Affairs Minister Amichel Shikli didn't hold back either. In his words, "Cowardice has a price." There was no coded language, no diplomatic hedging. Israel is accusing Western leaders, including Britain's Prime Minister, of emboldening the killers. So how did Britain respond? Well, you'd think with 2 Israeli diplomats murdered and the killer reportedly shouting pro-Palestinian slogans that the UK might reaffirm its support for Israel. Maybe strengthen diplomatic ties, perhaps call out the rising tide of anti-Semitism. No, Keir Starmer's government froze trade talks with Israel. Sanctions were imposed, not on the terror groups who cheered this killing, but on Israeli settlers in the West Bank. And now we hear on the grapevine that the UK Foreign Secretary David Lammy is going to go along with some other states and give political recognition to a Palestinian state, with no defined borders, a reward for terrorism, the 2-state solution that Hamas regards as a mere blood-soaked stepping stone to the destruction of Israel. And Starmer? Yeah, okay, he condemned the shooting, saying that anti-Semitism is an evil we must stamp out, but there was nothing in his statement to suggest a change of course, no recognition that his own government had just effectively punished Israel, after 2 of its citizens were gunned down in an American capital. But while Israel blames Starmer, he is busy blaming the far right, the likes of Peter Lynch, Lucy Connolly and Tommy Robinson. Let's step back for a moment, because this situation doesn't exist in isolation. Since October the 7th, 2023, when Hamas launched its massacre inside Israel, butchering civilians in their homes, the West has slowly slid from solidarity with Israel to appeasement of its enemies. The propaganda activities of Hamas in Western countries is paying off handsomely. Pro-Palestinian marches now dominate central London every other weekend. They block streets, wave Hamas-linked banners, shout chants that leave no room for Jews to exist between the river and the sea. And the UK authorities let it happen. In fact, some would say they actively facilitate it with the actions of a supine two-tier policing policy. These marches aren't spontaneous grassroots expressions of peace either. They're highly organised and have been since the very day after the October the 7th, 2023 atrocities. They are political displays of force, tolerated by the establishment, while Jewish communities are increasingly fearful to walk in public displaying any sign of their identity. And what has this culture of appeasement produced? 2 Israeli citizens gunned down in Washington. Murder, followed by a political shrug. And while Starmer stays silent on the accusations made by Israel's leaders, he's quick to reassure his activist base that the war in Gaza must stop. Something Hamas craves, as it gives them time to rearm, reorganise and mount fresh attacks on Israel and Jews. Now, we don't yet know how much about the alleged killer, 30-year-old Elias Rodriguez from Chicago. Police say he wasn't on their radar. But here's what we do know. He allegedly approached his victims with intent. He allegedly declared his motive with Free Palestine chants after being arrested. And according to police, he willingly led them to the discarded weapon. He wasn't known to the authorities, but the ideology that drove him, that's been out in the open for months and years. It's been marching through London with impunity. It's been posted across social media with blue ticks. It's been allowed to seep into public discourse because calling it out is seen as offensive. And now the consequences are real. Benjamin Netanyahu called it what it was, a horrifying anti-Semitic murder. He ordered security at Israeli embassies worldwide to be stepped up. But he went further. Blood libels against Israel are costing us blood. They must be fought relentlessly. Donald Trump, never shy about his plain words, said, "These horrible DC killings based obviously on anti-Semitism must end now." And Israeli Ambassador Yeshiel Leiter was clear. This young couple was gunned down in the name of Free Palestine. He confirmed that Trump personally pledged to tackle anti-Semitism and said Israel will not cower. But Britain, trade talks suspended. Keir Starmer, condemnation without consequences. And the so-called moral clarity we were promised under a Labour government, nowhere to be seen. This isn't just about one attack or one set of victims. This is about what kind of world we're going to live in. If people can march openly in Western capitals under banners that call for Israel's eradication, if politicians cave to that pressure instead of pushing back, then more attacks will follow. And we need to be honest. These aren't isolated cases. There is a thread running between the ideology shouted on London streets and the bullets fired in Washington, D.C. Now, Israel has a right to defend itself, full stop. After October the 7th, that right was never in question. But since then, the same voices that blamed Israel for being attacked have been given louder and louder megaphones, while Western leaders shrink back from drawing moral red lines. Israelis are now being killed far from their homeland, and their blood is staining the hands of those who chose appeasement over truth. So ask yourself this. Why is the UK punishing Israel just days after 2 of its citizens were murdered by someone shouting pro-Palestine slogans? Why are our streets still full of people chanting "from the river to the sea" while Jews here are advised to hide their identity? And why is the only country held to account for defending itself the one country that was attacked, Israel? These are not rhetorical questions. They're questions that demand an answer and demand action. If you believe Israel has a right to exist and to defend that right, then make your voice heard, because silence, as we've just seen, has a price. And that price is now being paid in blood. Finally, please like, subscribe and comment below, and a big shout out to our Patreon supporters, and thank you for watching.